let's talk about specifically what are some of the ways that you can differentiate your product. There are two categories of differentiation. There's product-based differentiation and brand-based differentiation. Product-based differentiation is exactly what it sounds like, right? I mean, they're both pretty, self-explanatory, but product-based differentiation is when there's some kind of attribute of your actual product that makes it different from the competition, where brand-based is, an aspect of your brand or your company, right? So we'll start with product-based differentiation. When it comes to product-based differentiation, there's a few different things you can do. First, you can differentiate yourself through sourcing. Sourcing is just, where do your ingredients or your products come from, right? There's a few great examples that you can see when you're walking into the grocery store. So let's put our little imagination hat on and let's think that we're, walking into a grocery store. And we walk through the produce aisle and the first thing we see is the seafood freezers, right? And in the seafood freezers, you might get two different types of shrimp. You might get a farmed white shrimp and you'll get like a Gulf white shrimp, depending on what market you're in, right? Some markets, they prefer like a brown shrimp, like if you're in Texas or Philadelphia or something like that. But what you usually find is that the wild caught Gulf white shrimp is going to be much more expensive when compared to, similar form of the farm product. Why is that? It's because the wild Gulf shrimp is able to position itself as a more premium source of the product, right? A lot of people in the culinary world will tell you that wild shrimp tastes a lot better because they're eating, food in the wild and what they're supposed to naturally eat. So there's much more nuances to their flavor versus a farm shrimp that's being fed soy-based pellets. It's going to have a much, milder flavor. And in addition to that, a wild caught Gulf shrimp is also positioned as a US-based product, right? It's not just positioned for no reason. It is a US-based product, right? And that's certainly a big selling point, buying American, right? That's one of the few things that has not been politicized that for the most part, I think Americans can agree on, that when you want to try to buy American. Now let's continue walking down our virtual grocery store and we walk into the meat aisle now. And in the meat aisle, you'll notice, especially these days, an increasing number of brands that are grass-fed versus corn-fed. This is another way of differentiating through sourcing, right? Even though, the cattle might come from the same company. One group of cattle was raised to eat grass. The other one was raised to eat corn. And so grass-fed beef is perceived as a much healthier product and as a result can command a much higher price on the shelf. Let's now walk down to the dairy aisle, right? Where funny enough, you'll find the orange juice. I've always thought that was weird, but that's where they keep the orange juice. And Tropicana is a very, big brand in the orange juice game, right? Usually you'll have entire windows of just Tropicana products. And what you'll notice in a lot of their packaging is that they call out the fact that their product is squeezed from fresh Florida oranges, right? And so not only is this a great way to differentiate, but it's also a great way to actually educate your consumer too. Because, for example, I had no idea that there was anything but fresh squeezed oranges in my orange juice. What are they squeezing them from? Are they frozen oranges? Are they not coming from the United States? Are they coming from somewhere else? So these sort of call outs not only help to differentiate, but they also, for the less knowledgeable consumer, help them to understand certain things like, oh, I didn't know that in this industry, you have domestic versus US product. And given the choice, I would like to pay a little more for this US based product. Now, some of us obviously will still shop based on price, but that's not who Tropicana is targeting. Tropicana is not targeting the end user who doesn't care what brand of orange juice they get and thinks they all taste the same and doesn't, really care where their product comes from. They're targeting the person that does care that they have fresh squeezed Florida oranges. Speaking of being a low cost option, that's also another way that you can do product based differentiation is, and we didn't mention it in the slideshow, but you can also choose to be the lowest cost option. Now that's a slippery slope, right? That's probably a road you don't want to get into because once you start getting into price wars with companies, usually the company with the deepest pockets is going to win that one, right? They can afford to lose money or reduce their profits on products for a much longer period of time than you can. So we don't recommend using that way as a method of differentiation. But if there's something unique to your process that helps you to be the lower cost option in a way that, doesn't create this race to the bottom, absolutely that's one route you can go. Speaking of processing, right? So we talked about sourcing, and again, sourcing here, we're talking about where your ingredients come from. Processing is what you're actually doing with those ingredients, right? So we're continuing to walk down our virtual grocery store, and we step into the coffee aisle. Here you'll see a lot of coffee companies are now labeling their products as fair trade certified, right? And what this means is that they're meeting certain labor standards, so that they're not using things like slave labor or child labor or things of that nature, because that's something that's quite common within that industry. And for their target audience, those particular companies have decided this is something that's important enough to my consumer that not only am I going to choose to make that part of my supply chain, but I'm also going to call this out on my packaging. Now, in addition to calling out differences in your supply chain, you can also call out differences in the kind of specifications that you use. Most industries have like some kind of established standard specifications. So if we talk about their pastries, for example, continue to walk into our little virtual grocery stores. Now we're, up the cereal aisle where you're going to find all the toaster pastries and stuff. There's going to be a ton of brands, and sure enough, all of them are going to carry some, basic core flavors, right? You're going to have your strawberry, you're going to have your cinnamon brown sugar, you're probably going to have a chocolate chip or some sort or something like that. Now, what a company like Kellogg's does differently with their Pop-Tarts brand toaster pastries is that they come up with some really crazy flavors. And this is great for their target audience, right? Because their target audience is parents, but their parents are buying this product for kids, right? So their different, flavors that they're constantly putting out appeal to kids, and also differentiate themselves from other standard toaster pastry brands that put out the same basic flavors you always see. Let's go back to the seafood aisle and, where we have our salmon fillets. And if you're walking into a store like Costco actually carries a totally different specification than any other company carries. Typically in the salmon industry, you have really two primary specs for fresh salmon. You have your skin on salmon fillet, which you call a D trim, and you have your skin off salmon fillet, which is an E trim. Costco does what you call an F trim, and an F trim is just, further trimmed so that there's, a lot less waste on it. It's a little more expensive of a cut. And in addition to that, they also choose to source their product from Norway. Chile and Canada are two of the biggest salmon producers in the world. And most of the product that you might buy in grocery stores, or if you're a restaurant owner that you might buy from a wholesaler, are going to come from one of those two countries. Norwegian product tends to be a lot more expensive because of the lower supply, but also because there's a perceived difference in quality, whether that's true or not, right? Because some people will tell you that farming practices have pretty much advanced all over the world, and it doesn't matter where you get a salmon fillet, quality is going to be roughly the same. But most consumers still perceive a difference in a Norwegian salmon versus a Chilean salmon, for example. And so not only did Costco differentiate themselves through their specification by doing something that's a little further processed than normal, but they're also choosing to differentiate themselves through sourcing, through where they're actually getting their product. Now, let's move on to brand-based differentiation, which again is when you highlight an attribute of your company or brand to differentiate yourself from the competition. When we talk about brand-based differentiation, there's so many different routes you can go down, and it's going to really vary based on industry. You're going to have to look at, your competitive landscape, the historical context of your industry. How did your industry develop? And really dig into to figure out how you can effectively do this. But a few different ways that you can do it, we'll talk about here. And the first being experience, right? You might be more experienced than the competition. A great example of that is a company called Phillips. They're a crab meat producer, but they're one of the first crab meat producers to really think about sustainability and, make themselves different than the competition. Even though a lot of these companies might be utilizing some of the same plants, some of the same sources of product, and oftentimes it'll be very difficult for you to tell the difference between one can of crab meat and another can of crab meat, right? Then you can also appeal to a certain lifestyle. So you take a company like Bragg's that makes organic apple cider vinegar. Like if you check out their website, they've got a ton of stuff about the different health benefits of apple cider vinegar. Their packaging is really highly focused on some of the health benefits of their product. And they're really much more tailored towards consumers who are health conscious. It might be, whether they're, on a diet temporarily, or if this is just, the way that they live, they're probably familiar with this brand. Another thing you can do is highlight your ownership, right? Your ownership structure might be different than most of the companies in your industry, right? Especially these days, There's a lot of minority owned businesses that really highlight that. Or, maybe you're woman owned, or maybe you're employee owned, right? Versus a lot of the corporations that you might be competing against. A great example of this is Ben and Jerry's, right? Now, Ben and Jerry's is actually owned by one of these big corporate food conglomerates, but they didn't always used to be. And their packaging still very much feels like a small company where you know the owners by name, right? Hence Ben and Jerry's. And not just that, but they're not very shy about letting their political positions be known. And that's something that's very unique, any industry, let alone the ice cream industry. And so this is one way that they're able to differentiate themselves and make themselves feel like anything but a big stuffy corporation, even though, they now belong to one. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to brand-based differentiation, you really want to try to position your company almost as a person, right? Because people don't want to buy from companies. They want to buy from people. They want to feel like the brand that they're, interacting with has some personality to it and actually cares about them and as a consumer.